Hello and welcome to The Review, where quality and trust come together. Each week we'll deliver new insights about strengthening your business through continual improvement, creating a safer, more secure world. I'm your host for this show, Randy Dorothy, Vice President of Business Development for the Performance Review Institute. Today we're joined by Justin McCabe, who is our Operating Manager of the MedAccred program. Justin, tell us a little bit about your background with MedAccred.
Sure. I started with the Performance Review Institute about 12 years ago. And at that time, the PRI board had decided that they wanted to expand the number of industries that the PRI had been working with. So historically, PRI was created to administer the NADCAP program for the aerospace industry. And it's very successful in improving critical process quality throughout the aerospace and defense industries. And I think it was in the early 2000s, there was a big downturn in the aerospace industry. And so they wanted to explore areas like medical device and transportation and power generation, nuclear and other industries to see if that model that had worked so well in the aerospace industry could be replicated. So I was brought in and really started having conversations with leading medical device companies in the medical device industry about the issues they were facing, from a product quality and reliability perspective, and the MedAccred, now it's called MedAccred concept, and was something that they saw as a really necessary approach to improving quality for their medical devices, and ultimately ensuring that the patients that would be using their devices, or the surgeons who would be using those devices in the operating room, would not be running into any issues and having a good outcome in the end.
So tell us a little bit about how the organization is structured, from a subscriber and so forth. Who's involved and what do they do?
So the MedAccred program we call it an industry managed program. So it's really the medical device industry that is managing the program, making the decisions for the program, and really owning the program. So the Performance Review Institute, our organization, we're a not-for-profit trade association. We put the infrastructure in place and facilitate the dialogue and the decisions that the industry are making. So if you think of PRI, and our role is really the foundation, we also allow these competing organizations to work together, or typically, they're not allowed to do that because they're competing on cost.
So really, they're working together to address common issues of quality, supply chain, critical processes that can impact any of their products.
Exactly.
So it's not a competitive nature; it's a collaborative kind of event.
Right. So our program and our approach is really focused on raising the bar in medical device quality, regardless of the product. So it could be a pacemaker, or an MRI machine, or a hip replacement. Right. So yes, it really is agnostic from a product perspective, but we are focused on the critical processes, the manufacturing processes that are going into making those products, and controlling those at a very technical level. So when I was talking about the different stakeholders involved in the MedAccred program, we have PRI at the core, and the OEMs who are making these products, they are actually managing and owning the decisions of the program, deciding which processes to develop and manage. And then there are the suppliers also, which are a very key stakeholder in this group. They are the manufacturers who are receiving the audits, and through our audit process, being able to validate that they have the quality and the capability in place to give their customers confidence that they can do work for them. And then I guess one other stakeholder group, and there are many more, but are our subject matter expert auditors. So the OEMs, they select auditors that are going out and auditing on behalf of their organizations, basically, and then they're using those audit results to support supplier oversight decisions and activities within the organizations, and also sourcing and procurement decisions when they're looking for new suppliers It's a very powerful tool for them
Right.
to support those
So
decisions.
where has the industry focused their primary critical processes at this point? Which processes are most important to them or highest risk, maybe is the way to look at that?
Sure. So when the program first began about 10 years ago, we had three large medical device companies, Philips, Stryker, and J&J, all sitting at the table and trying to figure out what are those critical processes that are most important to our organizations. Where are we seeing the most risk, the most product failures, recalls, and things like that. We also brought in FDA's perspective into that.
Right.
So from an inspectional perspective, where were they seeing, these types of suppliers are not able to control their processes? So it was a long discussion and many discussions at the beginning. And really, the initial processes we focused on were sterilization, printed circuit board assemblies, cable and wire harness, heat treating, welding. So those were some of the early processes that we focused on because, again, from a product perspective, it didn't matter if you're making an MRI machine or a pacemaker. You needed to make sure that they were properly sterilized or that they had electronic components like printed board assemblies and cable and wire harnesses.
Yeah, it's pretty important that the electronics work if you have, equipment like that you're relying on to give you diagnosis or
Right.
to continuation, pacemakers or whatever it might be.
Right.
So any failure of any of those products could be catastrophic for the patient.
Exactly. And so we started with those 4 or 5 key processes at the beginning, and we've since added processes like sterile device packaging, which is also really critical, and a lot of issues are coming out of those suppliers, as well as labeling, printing in UDI, and others. And then there's a long list of, a wish list of maybe 30 or 40 additional processes like 3D printing and software and others that we'll be developing over time.
Yep.
As our stakeholder base grows.
All right. So talk a little bit about the quality system expectation already in the industry, because we're looking at critical process. What's the difference between the critical process and a basic quality system? So maybe what's the basis of the quality system, first of all?
Sure. So the historical approach to quality within the med device industry and other industries is really, focused on the quality management system. And that quality management system might look different depending on which industry you're from. So if you're within the aerospace, it would be an AS 9100. Maybe a general industry QMS would be an ISO 9001 or 9000.
Yep.
If you're from automotive, it might be TS 16949. But that is really a kind of a standard that most customers, when they're looking for a supplier, want to have that confidence that a supplier has a good QMS in place. And that means that, as an organization, regardless of the technology that you're manufacturing, you have you're doing a management review, that you have a training program in place, that if there are nonconformances identified, that you have a corrective action and preventative action program in place to address those nonconformances. Right. So at an organizational level, you have a QMS, and that's really where the industry had been prior to NADCAP and prior to now MedAccred. And it was not technically focused, right? You may get lucky and have an auditor come in, right, and who, say, if you're an injection molder and you happen to get an injection molding expert come in and do your QMS audit, they may have focused on the technical aspects of your process. However, what MedAccred did was make sure that every time an audit was conducted, we were doing a deep dive technical assessment of a supplier's capability. So our prerequisite for a MedAccred audit is first to ensure that a supplier has a valid QMS in place. So we say, okay, you have a 13485 cert on the wall, great. That means we can now schedule a MedAccred audit and come in and do our
So it's a prerequisite review to have the QMS before you can do the critical process MedAccred accreditation audit.
Right.
Because, I've heard it described that the QMS goes across the whole organization, like you described, management review, internal audits, corrective actions, and where the critical process is a deeper dive. Are we achieving our goals on all the critical process characteristics of plastic sterilization, whatever it might be.
Right. Right. So yeah, I've heard it explained, QMS is an inch deep and a mile wide, and a MedAccred audit is an inch wide and a mile deep.
Yeah.
And we are spending many times 3 or 4 days at a single manufacturing facility, most of that time on the shop floor, talking to the operators, looking at the equipment, looking at the temperature and humidity controls. So a very detailed look at that process from PO all the way through to the final shipment.
And that's why you said the OEMs select the auditor based on their expertise. So these people are experts in their field, whether it be plastics or sterilization, so that they can go that mile deep to validate and give the trust back to the OEMs that, in fact, they do meet that requirement.
Right. It is our auditors who are part of the special sauce, I guess, if you will, of MedAccred, but pair that with our very detailed audit criteria. So backing up from a key stakeholder perspective, the OEMs, so currently we have 9 of the largest medical device companies who subscribe to MedAccred. So that's J&J, Philips, Stryker, Baxter, Boston Scientific, BD, Medtronic, and I'm probably forgetting a few others, but they each select subject matter experts in each of these critical processes, and they participate in what we call task groups. So for example, we have a plastics injection molding task group that has SMEs in plastics injection molding from J&J, Philips, and Stryker, all working together and collaborating to develop first a very detailed audit criteria for that process. So we'll spend around a year or two to create a 50 to 100 page document that really goes deep into the plastics injection molding process and very specific to sub-processes within that. So if you're at a supplier who does injection blow molding or insert molding, we'll be looking at that. Or if they have thermoplastics or elastomers, we'll change our approach to auditing based on what their capability is. And so they'll spend 2 years or a year or two developing that audit criteria and then selecting the subject matter expert auditors for that process. And then we can go out and conduct an audit and really make sure that the supplier is meeting those requirements.
So something unique about the medical device industry is the OEM contract manufacturer relationship. Can you talk a little bit about that and how they can become kind of co-owners or subscribers?
Sure.
First of all, what are the differences, and then how do they fit into the over governance of the system?
Sure. So when the program first began, we started working with the OEMs, and really those are the medical device manufacturers who are putting their name on the product. So when you get a hip replacement and you see Stryker printed on that, or if you're getting a pacemaker with Medtronic's name on that, they are the OEM who has the responsibility for that product. But underneath, to get that product to market, they need a large supply chain to make the individual components and processes within that. And one of the unique things that the medical device industry does, and I know other industries do this as well, they have contract manufacturers who they'll sub out portions of or entire product lines to that contract manufacturer. And the product will be completely made outside of, say, J&J's or Stryker's walls, and then in the end, it will, J&J or Stryker will put their name on it. So the contract manufacturer has all of the manufacturing capability. They have oversight or visibility of all the sub-tier suppliers that go into making that product. And then Stryker, as the OEM, has, they're regulated by FDA to have control over all those contract manufacturers and suppliers. But many times, they're leaving all the subject matter expertise to the contract manufacturer. So the MedAccred program started really focused on the OEMs, but realized after a few years of better understanding the med device industry that we also need to engage with the contract manufacturers, because they are the ones who have the closer relationship sometimes with the sub-tier suppliers. And that's really what MedAccred focuses on, is making sure that the quality is not driven just into the tier 1 and tier 2 within the supply chain, but further down into the supply chain. So making sure that the tier 4, 5, 6 level supplier is also able to meet the requirements, and then that then ensures that the final product is going to be the highest quality.
So if a company wanted to be accredited, what are some of the basic steps that they would go through to meet that requirement?
So the first step would be to engage with our team to just talk about what MedAccred is and how it can add value to their organization. We have a lot of case studies and survey results over the years that can help a company make that decision.
A business case information like performance metrics and things like that.
Sure.
Yep.
Sure. And a lot of times suppliers are starting to hear from their customers that MedAccred is a requirement or is something that will help them to get additional business or maintain business with that customer. So a lot of times we'll hear from a supplier, hey, my customer XYZ told me to come and talk to you. What's the next step? So what we'll do is get them registered in our audit system. We give them a copy of the audit criteria. So it's an open book test, the MedAccred audit. We give you all the questions ahead of time. And that's one of the other things that is a differentiator with MedAccred is that, yes, we have subject matter experts in these spaces, but they have to answer every single question in that audit criteria. They're pairing their subject matter expertise with the question that the industry has developed and then documenting the objective evidence for that. So we give them the audit criteria. We require them to conduct an internal audit prior to us coming in and doing an audit. So some suppliers, it'll take them 30 days to do that process. Some 2 years. It really depends on their readiness and
level of commitment.
Right? So we give them that audit criteria, and PRI has some tools available to help suppliers. We can conduct a pre-audit for those suppliers using that full audit criteria, and we'll leave the results with the supplier to address any gaps prior to their full accreditation audit. We also have some training programs available. So if they are getting ready for a printed board assembly audit, we'll have one of our printed board assembly SMEs spend a day or two with their team just to make sure that they understand the requirements and answer any questions they have about the audit process.
Great.
And then there are also tools available actually within the U.S. The Department of Commerce has funding available to help small and medium-sized manufacturers on their MedAccred journey. So what they'll do is they'll fund a pre-audit for suppliers. And then if there are any gaps identified during that pre-audit, they will provide resources and consulting support to help that supplier close the audit, those gaps in the audit process. And that program is called MedMap. I know you have had a question about that later on in the discussion here, but
that's great because it all ties together.
Right.
Once a company commits to it, they've talked to their customers and the customers say, hey, we either give acceptance or preference or mandate or requirement. They then go off and get the checklist from PRI, MedAccred.
Right.
And then they would go ahead and work on the implementation, possibly with MedMap or internally, however they wanted to do that. So once they go through the audit, they're issued a certificate, right?
Yeah, and it could take a while to get that certificate as well. So it's not, you don't just have to complete the audit. And really, it depends how well you prepare ahead of time. And again, it's an open book test. So, some suppliers will spend a few years preparing for the audit. And then once the audit is conducted, there is a process to, if nonconformances are identified, to work with our PRI staff engineer to make sure that those nonconformances are closed out effectively and aren't going to reoccur.
Right.
So that process, that back and forth process, can take anywhere from, again, a month to a year sometimes if a supplier has to buy new equipment or if they have to implement a new training program. We need to make sure that those corrective actions have been implemented and are effective before an accreditation decision can be made. But once that process is complete, the whole audit package then goes to back to the task group, those
Uh-huh.
SMEs from J&J, Stryker, Philips, and BD and others, and they review the audit report and say, all right, from our company's perspective, has this supplier met the requirements that we set as an industry? And so each company individually votes to determine if that supplier achieves an accreditation. So, so we'll ask Stryker, J&J, and Philips, hey, has the supplier met the requirements? And if they say yes, the supplier gets accredited, and that they'll get a cert they can put on their wall, and that will last for 12 months, and then we'll come in and do another re-audit using the full audit criteria.
So it's not a one and done? I mean, once you meet it,
No,
that's it?
no, it's a continuous process.
So you maintain your accreditation as long as you're willing and committed to doing so.
Right.
And you just have to have your annual audit to make sure that you continue to meet those requirements.
Right. Right. And the audit criteria continues to evolve and improve, as standards change, as we get additional perspectives and stakeholders involved in the audit criteria review process. And also on the supplier side, as you know, things are always changing.
Right.
Personnel changes, maybe you move a manufacturing location. So, we need to make sure that at least on an annual basis, we're able to in that point of time, ensure that the supplier is still meeting the requirements that the industry has set for that process.
So we talked a little bit about some of the external benefits of a company going through the accreditation process, satisfy your customers. What are some of the internal benefits that we've seen through the audit process and maybe through the task groups? I'm assuming that any kind of improvement in your quality system or your critical processes has generated some good results.
Definitely. So we started conducting MedAccred audits in about 2015, and have since then every few years conducted a supplier survey. So we reach out to all the accredited suppliers and say, yeah, congratulations, you've achieved accreditation and you've been able to maintain that over a number of years. What really has been the value to your organization? So yes, to some companies it was a requirement. Right. So they were told you either have to get accredited, and if not, sorry, you're not going to be our supplier anymore, or we're not going to give you a new business. But for other suppliers, they did it voluntarily. They wanted to set themselves apart from other competitors in the industry and really have MedAccred be a differentiator for their companies. But we issue this survey every few years just to get a pulse on what value is MedAccred really bringing to these companies, regardless of whether it's required or not. And the results have been just outstanding. I think in the latest survey, which we did in the middle of 2022, 85% of the accredited suppliers said that MedAccred is adding value to the organization, both from a quality perspective and from a business perspective. From a quality perspective, suppliers are seeing a reduction in in-house defect rates. They're seeing a reduction in defective products being shipped to their customers. So, they do keep metrics of defective products that have left their manufacturing facility, and as a result of MedAccred, suppliers are seeing less of that happening. From a new business perspective, suppliers are seeing new business from their current customers and from new customers as well, and then also seeing a greater customer satisfaction rating from their customers as a result of MedAccred. So yeah, the supplier survey is really shining a light on the value to suppliers. And then what we're also doing with these suppliers is develop some individual case studies. So what does that look like to an individual plastics injection molder, right? And some of these suppliers are saying that, yeah, we track our defective parts per million, and we saw, for over a number of years, we had about 500 DPPM, and now we're down to 300. And they're pointing to MedAccred as one of the reasons for that reduction.
I think that's interesting that there's actually a return on investment of implementing the system internally from your improvement savings, but also from your new business opportunity,
right?
Or retention. I mean, it could be offense, like I want to win more business, or it could be defense. I want to keep the customers I have.
Right.
So that's a very good a benchmark and some information to share with companies that are considering that.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about FDA. We know FDA is a regulatory body of the government, and they're very interested in medical device safety, obviously for patient safety. But talk about some of their involvement.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, really early on in the origins of the MedAccred program, we wanted to make sure that the regulators had a voice at the table, because they are one of the key stakeholders in the med device industry, right? If FDA is ultimately the one approving the manufacturing of these devices and getting them out into the market and being used. So we really wanted to pull them into the conversation early. And I think it was maybe 1 year after we had our initial discussions about the MedAccred concept, we sat down with them in Washington, D.C. We were at FDA, CDRH, and a number of other stakeholder groups within FDA, and they were very supportive of the MedAccred concept, because one, it's addressing quality issues that they're uncovering in their inspections in these different critical process areas. And also, they love it when industry can come together and solve a problem rather than it being forced through a regulation, right? Mm-hmm. So the MedAccred concept made a lot of sense to them. And so every few years, over the last 10 years, we would go to DC and provide them updates on where we are with MedAccred. We're adding these new critical processes where we have these new OEMs joining the program as subscribers. And so they continued to be very vocally supportive of MedAccred. And through all those discussions, they kept saying, we love the program, but we want to be able to do something to give credit to suppliers who are getting accredited, and also to the OEMs who are using these suppliers. And so it was really a few years ago, it was during the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, we were able to start meeting with FDA virtually. We didn't have to fly into DC, which was nice, because it was easy to set up a call with FDA and say, hey, can we meet? And we didn't have to coordinate everybody's schedules. We just needed an hour of their time or whatever. So a few years ago, we met with Bill Maisel and his team at CDRH and talked about where we were with MedAccred. There was a lot of interest in what we were doing in the sterilization space. There have been a lot of quality issues in the sterilization area within the device industry, particularly around ethylene oxide and other areas. And also, this is a technology that is highly regulated by the FDA. So FDA has inspectors that are going out to contract sterilizers and conducting deep dive quality and technical assessments at these contract sterilizers. So what MedAccred has been building over the last decade and already implementing and auditing at contract sterilizers really aligns with what FDA has been doing as well. So Bill Maisel and his team suggested that we conduct a pilot audit through the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, who was a partner or a collaborator with FDA to pilot their Case for Quality initiative a number of years ago. So there was some background or some previous pathways that FDA had used to use an approach to improve quality through the industry. And so we started partnering with MDIC and FDA to develop a pilot program for our sterilization audits. And we are currently in the middle of that program with FDA and MDIC. And we'll see what the results of the pilot are. But I think one of the potential outcomes would be that FDA may replace FDA inspections with MedAccred audits, so that a contract sterilizer would see less of FDA, and then they can also use the MedAccred audit to reduce the number of redundant audits they're getting from their customers as well, which is significant.
Which, I'm sure these companies have FDA and supplier audits all the time, so that this is a way that they could reduce that over auditing, because that's what you do. Your job, you show up and you've got to walk people through your facility all the time.
Right.
This might give them some relief of that. You can actually go back to, running the product and the processes.
Right.
I think also with budget cuts and everything else, with the FDA and other regulatory bodies, they're under constraints with resources and time. And so
Exactly.
if they could recognize a quality program, because they've liked the concept through the development, this pilot program was more or less to prove the concept to them.
Yes.
Because they were looking over the shoulders of the auditor saying, yeah, that's what I would look at too.
Right.
I agree with that.
Right.
So I think the outcome of that will resonate back to their top management to say, hey, this is a good partnership, industry solving it.
Mm-hmm.
MedAccred's playing a critical role. They're an independent auditor of this group.
Right.
And I think ultimately that'll be very helpful.
Right.
And, suppliers will love less oversight and less audits if they could do that.
Right. Right. Yeah, I did want to just mention, just double click on the reduced number of audits for contract sterilizers.
Mm-hmm.
I think overall the MedAccred program is a supply chain quality program
Mm-hmm.
that is enabled by procurement to improve quality through the device industry. However, on the contract sterilizer side, quality is definitely key, but also that reduction of redundant audits. Many of these contract sterilizers are being audited to death, more or less, and just they have full audit teams that host audits week after week, all year long.
You're listening to The Review, a podcast by the Performance Review Institute. I'm your host, Randy Darthy. Thank you for listening. Learn more about The Review at p-r-i.org.